August 1945. The Pacific lies still, a vast mirror of defeat. The typhoons have passed, the guns have fallen silent, yet beneath the calm surface, the wrecks remain. Steel skeletons of a vanished fleet Meitsui rest in the deep. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, names once spoken with pride, now whispered as epitaphs. The sea has claimed them, and with them, the spirit of an empire that built its power on water. For years, Japan's sailors fought across this endless ocean, carried by conviction and ritual discipline. But by 1945, there were no fleets left to command. The proud carrier groups that had once darkened the skies over Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea were gone, hunted, bombed, and burned beneath the relentless tide of industrial war. Each ship that sank took with it not only aircraft and steel, but experience, navigators, mechanics, signalmen, men trained through years of hardship, gone in a single hour of flame. This was not one battle's loss, but a slow erasure, a generation consumed by the ocean they once ruled. Japan still produced aircraft, elegant and deadly in design, but their hangars stood empty. Young cadets replaced veterans, flying with weeks of training into a sky they barely understood. The empire had planes, but no men left who knew how to fly them home. In those final months, the naval bases of Kure and Yokosuka were silent. Pilots watched from the shore as the sea that once carried their nation's dreams lay indifferent, scattered with the bones of their comrades. The rising sun still rose each morning, but it no longer shone upon a fleet. It rose instead over a nation haunted by ghosts of steel. And yet, in Tokyo, as the ashes settled, a new kind of war was already beginning, one not of ships or sailors, but of memory and survival. Statistics tell the truth quietly. Of Japan's carrier aviators trained before 1942, more than 90% were dead by 1944. No other branch of the Japanese armed forces suffered such silent extinction. These were not anonymous soldiers lost in the mud of China or the jungles of Burma. They vanished into the sea, men without graves, remembered only in oil slicks and the pale shimmer of foam that marked where they fell. Their disappearance did not come in a single moment of disaster. It was a long, methodical unraveling, a slow draining of knowledge that no command could reverse. From Coral Sea to Midway, from Santa Cruz to the Philippine Sea, each battle took its harvest of skill. Veteran pilots who once moved as extensions of their machines were replaced by boys who had learned to fly in weeks, not years. The once seamless choreography of takeoffs and landings became chaos, aircraft crashing into the waves, misjudged turns scattering formations meant to strike as one. By 1944, American airmen were meeting new enemies each month, faces they had never seen before and would never see again. For them, the air war became a cycle. New opponents, same outcome. For Japan, it became a tragedy of attrition. The empire that had entered the war with unmatched naval aviation ended it with instructors younger than their students. It was not only steel and aircraft that the United States destroyed, but time itself, the years of training that forged a pilot's instinct. In Japan's war planning, arrogance had replaced preparation. They believed early victories would last forever, that courage could substitute for practice. But courage cannot rebuild experience once it has sunk. A fleet can be rebuilt, factories can rise from ashes, but skill, the quiet, invisible mastery of men who have survived 100 missions, cannot. And as Japan searched for replacements, another, even greater loss was already forming beyond the horizon, one that no amount of training could prepare them for. Japan's naval code was built upon an illusion that courage was infinite. From the first days of the Imperial Navy, valor was treated not as a virtue, but as a duty. To hesitate was dishonor. To fear was treason. It was a creed that inspired men to dive through fire and storm, but also one that blinded them to the limits of flesh and time. The early victories seemed to prove it true. From the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, Japanese carrier pilots struck with surgical precision. Their enemies faltered, and Tokyo saw destiny in the smoke. The myth of invincibility hardened into doctrine. Bravery could replace numbers, and sacrifice could substitute for industry. No one asked what would happen when courage met exhaustion. Midway was the answer. In that single June morning of 1942, 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost within hours. With them went not only aircraft and command, but the finest aviators Japan had ever produced. The men who had mastered the impossible art of deck landings, who had survived years of flight over the Pacific, were consumed in fire. It was the last generation of mastery, gone in a single day. What followed was not renewal, but desperation disguised as faith. Training schools shortened their courses from 2 years to 3 months. Students who once studied aerodynamics and tactics now memorized prayers. They took off from runways without ever practicing carrier landings, their instructors killed before they could teach. Where the Americans produced thousands of pilots trained in simulators and twin-seaters, Japan sent barely trained boys into skies filled with radar and gunfire. By 1945, the creed of infinite bravery had devoured itself. Pilots were told their bodies were weapons, their deaths a form of victory. The kamikaze became not an evolution of strategy, but the end of it, the moment when a nation mistook sacrifice for strength. In the silence that followed each failed mission, Japan's admirals began to understand what their code had cost them. Bravery had not saved the empire. It had exhausted it. But even as the pilots vanished, another illusion was about to take hold, one that promised salvation not through courage, but through technology. The Imperial Japanese Navy was born not in humility, but in triumph. In 1905, at Tsushima, its cruisers annihilated the Russian fleet in a single day, a victory so complete it stunned the Western world. Japan, a nation barely 4 decades into modernity, had defeated a European empire at sea. From that moment, its naval officers carried not just pride, but a sense of destiny. They believed themselves the heirs of samurai discipline, warriors reborn in steel and salt water. In the decades that followed, the Navy became more than a military branch. It was an ideal. Its aviators, the youngest and most daring of its caste, were trained as the elite of the elite, men expected to merge precision with devotion. Entry into flight school was reserved for the exceptional. Out of every 100 applicants, only a handful would reach the carrier decks. The rest were dismissed, broken by exhaustion or failure. For those who remained, the reward was not comfort, but greater trial. Training was ruthless. In the 1930s, pilot candidates spent months landing biplanes on short pitching decks, exercises repeated until muscle memory replaced fear. They practiced in storm conditions, touching down on rain-slick planks, guided only by lanterns and instinct. Every mistake risked death, but every success was a sacred act, a proof of harmony between man, machine, and sea. Instructors watched in silence, knowing that mastery had a cost measured in lives. Discipline was enforced with the same severity. Cadets were taught that fatigue was weakness, individuality a defect. They lived under constant inspection, uniforms creased to regulation, speech formal, eyes fixed ahead. Behind the discipline was belief that through suffering came transcendence. The aviator was not merely a soldier, he was a vessel of the emperor's will. By the mid-1930s, Japan's carrier force was the most skilled on Earth. Their pilots flew with the composure of craftsmen and the calm of ritual. Western observers marveled at their precision, unaware that it was built upon attrition, that every flawless maneuver had been purchased with another man's failure. They were called the Emperor's Falcons, symbols of a new Japan that believed mastery could defeat mathematics. Their skill was sacred and irreplaceable. But in the pursuit of perfection, they had built something brittle, a force so rarefied that it could not survive loss, and soon loss would come. From its very beginning, the Imperial Japanese Navy was built around a single belief, that wars were not won through endurance, but through one magnificent strike. The doctrine was ancient in spirit and modern in form. The decisive battle, swift and total, delivered with the precision of a sword stroke. It was a creed born from Tsushima and refined by decades of war games, lectures, and ritualized certainty. Victory, they believed, would belong not to the side that endured longest, but to the one that struck first and struck perfectly. In December 1941, that belief took flight. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, steamed east under a winter sky, carrying 353 aircraft and the hopes of an empire. The operation had been rehearsed for months in the bays of Kyushu. Pilots memorized the silhouettes of American ships by lantern light. Mechanics drilled in silence. Navigators practiced celestial fixes in total darkness. Every man aboard believed he was part of something destined, the decisive blow that would end a century of Western intrusion. At dawn on December 7th, the prophecy was fulfilled. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay burning in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Battleships that had symbolized American pride, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, rolled and sank beneath columns of smoke. Japan had achieved the impossible, the perfect ambush, the textbook victory. The pilots returned to the decks to cheers, their uniforms soaked in salt and oil, their faces shining with belief. To a nation that revered the samurai ideal, they had become the modern gods of war. But perfection can be its own trap. The doctrine that raised them also doomed them. Japan's entire naval strategy rested on the assumption that one strike would decide everything, that the enemy would accept defeat rather than adapt. There was no plan for a drawn-out war, no machinery for replacement, no understanding of what a nation like the United States could build once awakened. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, as factories in California and Michigan began to roar, the illusion began to fracture. Japan had won its decisive blow, and in doing so, had chained itself to an idea it could never repeat. The empire celebrated its triumph as destiny fulfilled. But in the quiet offices of the Naval General Staff, a few men already sensed the truth. The strike that began the war had also defined its end, and in the blue silence of the Pacific, the hunters would soon become the hunted. At the dawn of 1942, Japan's naval aviators stood at the peak of their craft. They were the finest in the world, disciplined, precise, and seemingly untouchable. Their victories at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Philippines appeared to confirm the myth that Japanese training had achieved perfection. Yet beneath that brilliance lay a fatal truth. The system that created these men was a masterpiece that could not be repeated. Training a carrier pilot in the Imperial Navy demanded years. Each student consumed thousands of liters of fuel, hundreds of flight hours, and constant supervision from instructors who had themselves survived years of peril. It was a system built for peacetime excellence, not wartime attrition. Every pilot represented an investment in time Japan could no longer afford, and time was the one resource no empire could reclaim. In 1941, the fleet still trained at a deliberate rhythm. Flights were measured, engines tuned, and errors studied with care. But after the war began, the tempo broke. The same air crews that struck Pearl Harbor were sent almost immediately to the Coral Sea, then to Midway, without rest or rotation. There were no replacements waiting in the wings, no new squadrons to share the burden. Japan's best pilots became victims of their own success, forced to fight endlessly, their skill slowly consumed by fatigue. Mastery eroded invisibly. Tiny mistakes multiplied, a misjudged approach, a forgotten signal, a delayed reaction under fire. These were not failures of courage, but symptoms of exhaustion. And yet, the command structure refused to see it. Belief in invincibility had hardened into doctrine. Admirals trusted that elite skill would always prevail, that one more victory would restore balance. The pilots obeyed because obedience was their creed. When defeat finally came at Midway, it arrived not as a shock, but as exposure. 4 carriers lost in a single day, and with them, the irreplaceable core of Japan's aviation. The battle destroyed more than ships. It destroyed continuity. The link between generations of experience snapped, leaving a vacuum no training program could fill. What had seemed perfect had only been fragile. Japan's naval air arm had achieved an art so refined that it could not survive the pressure of war. Perfection, they learned too late, is not strength, it is brittleness. And as the surviving pilots returned to bases across the Pacific, they found themselves facing a new enemy, one they could neither outfly nor outfight, the enemy of time itself. June 4, 1942. At dawn, the Pacific is calm, a vast stage for the clash that will decide its future. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, approach Midway Island in perfect formation, their decks alive with motion. Engines roar, signal flags rise, and the air smells of fuel and salt. On paper, the operation is flawless. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan prepares to repeat its triumph on an even grander scale. Their goal is not just conquest, but annihilation, to lure the last remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap and finish what began in Hawaii. Yet beneath the calm precision lies overconfidence. The men of the 1st Air Fleet believe themselves invincible. They have defeated every foe they've faced. Their tactics are unchallenged, their machines refined through discipline and sacrifice. But they do not know that their enemy has changed. Through broken codes and quiet patience, the Americans are waiting. At 10:25 a.m., fate arrives in the form of a dive bomber's scream. From 20,000 feet, squadrons of U.S. Dauntless aircraft descend on the Japanese formation. Within 5 minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, are struck almost simultaneously. Bombs pierce their decks, igniting the fuel lines beneath. Flames race through hangars crowded with armed planes, turning steel into furnaces. The precision that once defined the Imperial Navy becomes its undoing. Efficiency means vulnerability. The same discipline that made Japan's carriers lethal leaves them unable to improvise when chaos begins. By afternoon, only Hiryu remains. Her surviving air crews launch a counterattack that cripples the U.S. carrier Yorktown, a final act of defiance carried out by men who know they will not return. Hours later, American dive bombers find her too. The 4th carrier burns into the sea, taking her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, and hundreds of veteran aviators with her. In less than a day, the heart of Japan's naval air power is gone. The losses are catastrophic. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen perish, among them more than 100 of Japan's finest carrier pilots, men who had trained since the 1930s, each representing years of knowledge, instinct, and craft. The Americans lose ships, yes, but not their lifeblood. Their pilots are recovered, their mechanics rescued, their experience preserved. Japan's, by contrast, sink with their vessels, leaving empty decks and silence where once mastery lived. Midway is remembered as a battle of bombs and explosions. In truth, it was a battle of experience, and experience died with the carriers. The difference between the two nations was not courage, but continuity. America could lose and learn. Japan could only lose and mourn. In Tokyo, reports of victory had already been prepared. Instead came disbelief, then denial. The press was silenced, and the Admiralty spoke of setbacks. But within the Navy, the truth was understood. The elite had been erased in 5 minutes. After Midway, Japan still had ships, still had planes, still had faith. But what it had lost was the irreplaceable thread that connected its golden generation to those who would follow. The empire stood at the height of its reach, yet hollowed from within. And as its admirals struggled to rebuild what could not be rebuilt, the Americans were already preparing their next lesson. One written not in skill, but in scale. Japan entered the Pacific War believing it would be short. 6 months of victory to force America to the negotiating table. That assumption guided every decision, every allocation of fuel, every line of doctrine. The empire had no plan for a conflict of years. Its admirals believed that courage, precision, and surprise would outweigh industry and numbers. For a time, they were right, but by 1943, the illusion had faded, replaced by the slow, grinding truth of modern war. Every campaign, from the Coral Sea to the Solomons, devoured pilots faster than Japan could replace them. The losses were not only in combat, they came from fatigue, from navigation errors, from fuel shortages that forced training flights to be cut short. The Imperial Navy's proud carrier divisions still sailed, but their decks grew quieter. Planes sat idle for want of men who knew how to fly them. The problem was not simply quantity, but time. A veteran pilot required nearly 2 years to produce, hundreds of hours in flight, thousands of liters of precious fuel, and constant guidance from experienced instructors. Yet those instructors had been sent to the front lines, where most never returned. By 1943, the Imperial Navy's training command had been gutted. Its schools became desperate simulacra of their former selves, fragments of a once perfect system trying to function in ruin. To escape Allied bombing, the flight academies were moved inland, to quiet valleys and forested plains. There, students practiced takeoffs on strips of dirt painted to resemble carrier decks. With little aviation fuel left, they simulated flight in classrooms, arms outstretched, reciting checklists to the rhythm of imagined engines. The sound of progress had become the whisper of chalk on blackboard. Aircraft shortages compounded the decline. Where once trainees learned on advanced trainers, they now shared a single plane among entire classes. Some schools used gliders, teaching theory without risk or meaning. Instructors spoke of the spirit of the samurai, of courage and selflessness, because there was nothing else left to teach. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing 10,000 new pilots a month, their training fields alive with motion. Japan produced fewer than 500, many with less than 1/10 the flying experience of their predecessors. By late 1943, the imbalance was no longer strategic. It was existential. Quantity replaced quality. Doctrine gave way to improvisation. The elite carrier groups that had once defined naval warfare became hollow formations, existing more in records than in reality. Crews rotated endlessly between units, patching holes in a system that was already collapsing. Admirals still issued orders as if they commanded fleets of old, but the spirit that had once animated those decks was gone. In Tokyo, few dared to say it aloud. But the truth was clear: the war Japan had planned was over. What remained was survival, a long retreat fought by the remnants of a force that had been designed only to advance. The empire that had begun its campaign with precision now stumbled through exhaustion. Its carriers still bore names of legend, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, but they sailed as shadows of themselves, their decks manned by novices, their air groups scattered by storms and inexperience. The war Japan believed it could win in months had become a war. It could not end in years. And as the Americans pushed across the Central Pacific, island by island, Japan's aviators were no longer fighting for victory, only to delay the inevitable. But even in defeat, there were those who still dreamed of reversal, men who believed that one final weapon could restore the empire's lost honor. By 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. The empire's strength had peaked 2 years earlier, and now the tide was turning, not through sudden defeat, but through an accumulation of momentum. While Japan's air ranks thinned, America industrialized the sky. From San Diego to Seattle, factories pulsed day and night, forging aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them. Steel, oil, and manpower fused into a single rhythm, the rhythm of replacement. Where Japan had treated skill as sacred, America treated it as system. Training was continuous, scientific, and modular. Pilots were not expected to die with honor, but to live, rest, and return, to pass on what they had learned. A rotation system kept veterans cycling through training commands, ensuring that every new pilot inherited the experience of those who had survived. The result was not brilliance, but endurance, a machinery of knowledge that grew stronger with every battle. In Japan, there was no such cycle. Pilots fought until they were dead, and the lessons of their deaths vanished with them. What had begun as a culture of mastery became one of martyrdom. Young men entered flight schools with reverence, but left with illusion, trained in weeks, told they carried the spirit of the divine wind. They believed it. Many never returned from their first mission. By the summer of 1944, the contrast had become absolute. The United States Navy now deployed 15 fleet carriers, each carrying over 90 aircraft. Avengers, Hellcats, and Dauntlesses, guided by radar and coordinated by radio networks that stretched across oceans. Japan, by contrast, could field only remnants, 9 carriers, many converted from merchant hulls, their flight decks filled with untested pilots and underpowered planes. The reckoning came on June 19th in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Seeking to halt the American advance toward the Marianas, the Imperial Navy launched 373 aircraft in waves from Guam and the Mobile Fleet under Admiral Ozawa. They flew into a sky they no longer understood, a sky filled with American radar, disciplined formations, and pilots who had learned from 2 years of relentless war. Within hours, the outcome was decided. Radar operators aboard U.S. ships tracked each approaching formation. Hellcats rose to meet them, diving from the sun with overwhelming coordination. The Japanese fought with courage, but courage was no longer enough. The technology, the training, the rhythm, all now favored the Americans. By evening, fewer than 50 of Japan's aircraft had made it back. Hundreds of pilots were lost, men who had spent years in training schools now gone in a single afternoon. American pilots, stunned by the one-sidedness of the fight, called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japan, it was the final unraveling, the day the empire's wings were truly clipped. Carriers still floated, but they had no air groups to carry. The empty decks were monuments to a vanished age, an echo of the skill and spirit that had once ruled the Pacific. In Tokyo, no celebration followed. There was only silence. The admirals who had built Japan's naval air arm understood what the loss meant. Not merely defeat in a battle, but the extinction of a tradition. The empire had spent its future in pursuit of perfection, and now it had nothing left to spend. But even in the ruins, another transformation was beginning, one born of despair, faith, and final defiance. A new kind of pilot was about to take flight, and his mission would not be to return. By October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a weapon. It was a memory. The Empire's last hope lay at Leyte Gulf, a battle meant to decide not victory, but legacy. Japan's admirals knew the war was lost in every material sense. No fuel, no trained pilots, no reserves. Yet pride demanded a final gesture worthy of the fleet's tradition. Thus they conceived one last operation, not of strength, but of deception. The plan was audacious. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled what remained of Japan's carrier force, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, and sent them south to lure the U.S. Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. On paper, it was a formidable formation. In reality, it was hollow. Their decks, once crowded with aircraft, now carried only a handful of decoys. Their hangars, once alive with the thunder of engines, echoed with emptiness. The real striking power, if any remained, was elsewhere, hidden among surface ships and suicide missions. Ozawa's fleet was bait, pure and deliberate. Among these ghosts sailed Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once the pride of the Imperial Navy, she now bore a different burden, the weight of remembrance. Her air group was gone, her veteran crews long since dead or scattered. The pilots who stood upon her deck in October 1944 were boys, many barely out of training, some who had never seen combat, most without the skill to land on a carrier's rolling deck. Yet discipline endured. Orders were obeyed. The illusion of power was maintained. On October 25th, the decoy worked. American reconnaissance spotted Ozawa's carriers and Admiral Halsey's fleet. 17 fast carriers, 6 battleships, and more than 1,000 aircraft turned north to engage. The Empire's empty sword had drawn the enemy's attention, but it came at a price. Within hours, the U.S. air groups descended. The sea around Zuikaku erupted in geysers of flame and steel. Bombs and torpedoes tore through her hull, igniting the aviation fuel that once fed victory. Aboard the ship, the crew moved with grim precision. Damage control teams fought fires they could not extinguish. Below decks, water flooded through ruptured bulkheads. On the bridge, officers maintained silence. No panic, no surrender. When the order finally came to abandon ship, Zuikaku's surviving men gathered on her listing deck. As smoke rose and her bow dipped beneath the waves, they faced east, toward the homeland, and raised the rising sun flag one final time. The ship that had opened Japan's war now closed it in solemn ceremony. Zuikaku sank slowly, her masts disappearing into the gray Pacific. For those who watched, it felt less like a defeat than a funeral. With her went not only the last carrier of Pearl Harbor's fleet, but the final embodiment of an age, the age of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had once redefined naval warfare. What began with precision and pride ended in ritual and silence. When the smoke cleared, Japan had no true carrier fleet left. The Empire's mastery of the air-sea frontier, once its greatest innovation, was gone. The decks that had once launched history's most daring pilots now rested at the bottom of the ocean. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would rage on, and other ships would die. But Zuikaku's final salute marked something greater, the death of the idea that had carried Japan to war. Yet even as her wreck settled into the depths, a new form of warfare was already rising from the Empire's desperation, one born not from mastery, but from sacrifice. By late 1944, The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed an air armada. Its pilots were gone, its carriers sunk, its doctrine erased by the tide of war. What remained was not strategy, but faith, and from that faith came desperation. In the ruins of a once masterful aviation corps, Japan discovered a new kind of weapon, men who would die on purpose. The transformation began quietly. As losses mounted and trained aviators became extinct, younger officers proposed a final answer, one rooted in the empire's oldest traditions. If skill could no longer achieve victory, perhaps sacrifice could. To strike the enemy with one's body, they argued, was not madness but duty. The idea resonated deeply in a culture already steeped in the myth of selfless devotion. It spread through briefing rooms and barracks until it ceased to sound like defeat. By October 1944, the concept had become official policy. The word kamikaze, divine wind, was revived from legend, evoking the typhoons that once saved Japan from Mongol invasion. Now, the divine wind would be man-made. Young men, some barely 18, were gathered into new, special attack units. They wrote farewell letters, received ceremonial headbands, and learned to aim, not to land. The same schools that had once forged precision now trained annihilation. Instructors who had spent years perfecting the art of flight found themselves teaching the mechanics of dying. Lessons in navigation and formation flying were replaced by instruction on how to dive into the enemy's hull. Aircraft design followed suit, simple, stripped-down machines built for a single use. The factories that had once produced instruments of mastery now turned out weapons of despair. In hangars across Kyushu and Okinawa, rows of newly built planes stood waiting, most without radios, many without landing gear. Each bore a painted chrysanthemum on its fuselage, a fragile symbol of eternal bloom. The pilots who climbed into them did so calmly, almost ritually. They were told that their sacrifice would halt the invader, that their deaths would cleanse the shame of defeat. For the surviving veterans, the few who had once flown from Akagi, Shokaku, or Zuikaku, the change was unbearable. They had spent a lifetime mastering an art that fused intellect and instinct, and now watched it reduced to ceremony. Where once pilots had trained for years to land on a moving deck, boys were now launched towards certain death with only hours of practice. It was not warfare, it was confession. The kamikaze attacks began at Leyte Gulf and intensified through 1945. Each mission was a small explosion against an ocean of steel. The first wave struck the escort carrier St. Lo, sending her to the bottom with hundreds of men. To the Japanese command, this seemed vindication, proof that sacrifice could still wound the enemy. But the Americans adapted quickly, strengthening defenses, deploying radar, and learning to anticipate the attacks. For every ship damaged, dozens of young lives vanished into the sea. Within months, thousands of aircraft were expended, thousands of boys consumed. Their deaths achieved little beyond prolonging the inevitable. Yet still they came, their flights guided by faith rather than fuel. The empire had turned its sky into a graveyard, its pilots into prayers. The carrier, once the supreme symbol of mastery, became a platform for suicide. On its deck, the distinction between skill and sacrifice disappeared. The sea that had once carried Japan's power now received its dead. In the eyes of the world, the kamikaze became a symbol of fanaticism, but to those who understood Japan's history, it was something more tragic, the final echo of a civilization that had mistaken devotion for destiny. When the sky itself becomes the weapon, the sea no longer matters, and in that silence, Japan prepared to face its final reckoning, one that would not come from the air, but from a light brighter than fire. By 1945, the empire that once ruled the Pacific existed only as fragments, airfields reduced to ash, carriers to coral reefs, and pilots to memory. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once stretched from the Indian Ocean to Hawaii, was gone. What remained were a few scattered defense units, manned by veterans too valuable to die and too few to matter. Their mission was no longer conquest, but endurance, to hold the sky a little longer while the nation beneath them burned. The seas that once thundered with engines were silent now. The great carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, lay broken beneath the waves. Divers would one day find their wrecks, still and immense, resting like cathedrals in the deep. But in 1945, their absence was felt more than their memory. For the men who had lived and died aboard them, there were no graves, no ceremonies, no closure. The ocean itself had become their monument. Japan still built airplanes, small, desperate machines, assembled in mountain tunnels and wooden factories hidden among pine forests. But the pilots who climbed into them were no longer warriors of the air. They were boys sent to die before learning to live. They took off from improvised runways, carrying more faith than fuel, and vanished into clouds that no longer concealed victory. Few returned, fewer still were remembered. In Tokyo, the once proud naval command had become an office of ghosts. Officers sat at empty desks, signing orders for squadrons that no longer existed. Reports came not of missions completed, but of silence, units missing, bases burned, fuel gone. The Empire's communication lines, once so precise, dissolved into static. What had been an orchestra of precision now hummed with the noise of collapse. For the surviving veterans, the war's end brought no triumph. Men who had once believed themselves immortal stood among ruins, watching a generation's perfection dissolve. They were not defeated in battle, they were consumed by the weight of their own creation. To witness the destruction of the carrier force was to watch the death of the modern samurai, a warrior class undone not by the enemy's fire, but by time itself. In July 1945, Japan still possessed aircraft, hundreds, perhaps thousands, but almost none were operational. There was no fuel to launch them, no crews to fly them, no navy left to guide them. The weapons of the Empire had become relics before the war had even ended. Each one represented a lesson unlearned, that skill without renewal is vanity, and courage without wisdom is ruin. When the surrender finally came, it did not feel like defeat, it felt like disappearance. The Empire did not fall with a roar, but with a sigh. Its power faded quietly, like a tide retreating from a shore it once claimed forever. The pilots who had begun the war as gods of the sky ended it as shadows, unburied, unspoken, their names carried only in the lists of the lost. In the years that followed, the wrecks of their ships would become reefs, and the stories of their courage would become legend. But for those who had lived it, there was no glory left to find, only the memory of what perfection had cost. The Empire's end was not marked by surrender or ceremony. It ended in absence, a silence deeper than defeat, where no engines roared, no flags waved, and no voices called out across the water. And somewhere beneath that quiet sea, the last echoes of a vanished fleet still drift through the dark, a reminder that even the brightest wings, once burned, leave no trace but shadow. August 1945. The war ends not with a fleet engagement, but with silence. Japan surrenders beneath a white flag on a grey morning, its empire reduced to ruins. Across the islands, the last fragments of the once mighty naval air arm sit idle in their hangars, engines cold, paint blistered by sun and rain. Of the carrier aviators who began the war, almost none remain. A few veterans, scattered across airfields and naval bases, live to hear the Emperor's voice announce the unthinkable. They stand in uniform, heads bowed, and listen to the surrender of the world they built with their hands. For these men, survival brings no relief. They have outlived their purpose. The art they mastered, the precision of deck landings, the discipline of formation flight, the instinct to strike at sea, belongs to a vanished age. There will be no more carriers to command, no more students to teach. The empire that trained them to perfection has ceased to exist, and the craft that defined their lives has dissolved into memory. Many never speak of the war again. In the years that follow, they retreat into anonymity, shopkeepers, mechanics, school teachers, carrying a silence that outlasts the peace. They know that their skill was not defeated by courage or by luck, but by numbers. The enemy had more planes, more fuel, more time. What Japan called spirit, America answered with arithmetic. The United States Navy, victorious and reflective, approaches its fallen opponent with unexpected respect. After the war, captured documents and surviving officers are studied carefully. American pilots, now heirs to the skies their enemies once ruled, read with quiet astonishment about the precision of Japan's early training, the takeoff drills in storm seas, the mathematical efficiency of coordinated strikes, the almost religious devotion to discipline. They learned that before the tide turned, Japan had achieved something extraordinary, a human machine so refined that it could not be sustained. In debriefing rooms and translated reports, a truth emerges that transcends ideology. The Imperial Navy's air arm was not undone by cowardice or incompetence, but by the limits of endurance. It built perfection and demanded it endlessly, until the men who embodied it were gone. The Americans study this with both admiration and sorrow, recognizing in their former enemy a reflection of their own ambitions. By the 1950s, the names of Japan's carriers are already fading from public memory. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, they survive in history books, in footnotes, in the murmured recollections of old sailors. But for those who remember, they are more than ships. They are symbols of a paradox, how mastery, when pursued without renewal, becomes a path to extinction. In Tokyo Bay, the U.S. flag rises over the decks of surviving vessels. The sea is calm, the sky without contrails. The world has entered a new age, one ruled by jet engines and atomic light. The carrier pilots who once believed they controlled the future now live to see themselves become relics of the past. Their silence is not shame, it is understanding. In the end, Japan's naval air arm was defeated not in spirit, but in scale. Its courage was real, its brilliance unquestioned, its devotion absolute. But in war, even brilliance must obey arithmetic. And as the last veterans fade into the quiet of post-war Japan, the empty sky above the Pacific carries their unspoken epitaph, that no amount of valor can outfly the mathematics of modern war, lost not only in battle, but in meaning. Their legacy was not triumph, but warning, that brilliance without continuity, courage without pragmatism, is self-destruction disguised as honor. The empire's pursuit of perfection had ended in a nation of ruins, and so Japan learned to value imperfection, to find its strength in humility rather than in conquest. By the 1960s, the new Japan had become an industrial giant. Its aircraft were now civilian. Its ships carried trade, not war. The Pacific, once a battlefield, was a highway of commerce. Children learned English in classrooms that overlooked the same harbors where carriers once sailed. The war was history, not denied, but diffused, reduced to textbooks and memorial days. Yet the ghosts of the carriers lingered. Fishermen spoke of strange sounds at night. The hum in the years after 1945, Japan began again, not as an empire, but as a nation humbled into peace. The steel of its warships was melted into girders for bridges and buildings. Airfields became rice fields once more. The sound of engines that had once carried death across the Pacific was replaced by the clatter of reconstruction. The old martial virtues, sacrifice, obedience, silence, were transfigured into new ones: diligence, innovation, restraint. The country rebuilt, not with swords, but with patience. And yet, beneath that modern calm, there remained an absence, a silence too vast to name. The story of the vanished aviators, the emperor's falcons, faded into the background of atomic light. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the defining images of the nation's suffering. The carriers, the pilots, the sea itself receded into a quieter kind of loss. Japan's new identity could not coexist with the memory of those who had once believed they were divine. In old photo albums, the past survived in fragments: young men in crisp uniforms, smiling on carrier decks, unaware that the horizon before them would be their grave. Their faces were clean, their expressions calm. To the generations born after, they seemed like strangers from another world, neither heroes nor villains, but figures from a dream that Japan had collectively chosen to forget. For those who did remember, the aging veterans, the widows, the few who had trained in the final months, the silence was both refuge and punishment. They understood what had been of engines beneath the water, the faint echo of planes that would never land. Divers exploring the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga described them as cathedrals of rust, eerily intact, the outlines of aircraft still visible on their decks. The sea, indifferent yet loyal, had preserved what the world had chosen to forget. Even today, the Pacific has its moments of remembrance. When storms roll in from the east, the wind howls across the waves as if reciting names: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Zuikaku. The rain strikes the surface like applause from a vanished audience. To those who listen closely, the ocean still speaks of that lost generation, not with anger, but with melancholy. In modern Japan, peace has become a principle as sacred as war once was. The self-defense forces train in silence, their mission bound by law to prevention, not projection. Few today would recognize the faces of the carrier pilots who once defined the empire's pride. Yet their story endures, invisible but pervasive, a warning carried forward in every act of restraint, every refusal to return to the path once taken. Memory drifts like oil upon the sea, thin, quiet, and iridescent, visible only when struck by light. And sometimes, when dawn breaks over the Pacific, that light returns for an instant, glinting over the waves that still hold the ghosts of men who flew too far, too fast, and vanished into history's calm. The Imperial Japanese Navy built the finest carrier crews on Earth, and in doing so, destroyed them. From the precision of their flight decks to the discipline of their formations, everything they achieved was an act of devotion. Devotion to mastery, to honor, to the illusion that perfection could defy time. For a few short years, it seemed to work. Their skill was so complete, it appeared divine. But perfection, like empire, cannot last. It feeds on itself until nothing remains to sustain it. These men fought as craftsmen of death, artists of a new warfare that united the machine with the human spirit. They believed that courage could overcome numbers, that faith could substitute for fuel, that loyalty could outlast logic. They fought as if the war were a ritual, not a calculus. Yet war is never poetic. It is only arithmetic. The enemy counted factories, pilots, oil, and time. Japan counted belief. The carriers that once embodied that faith, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, were monuments to an idea, that a nation could will itself into greatness through sacrifice alone. When they burned, It was not only metal that perished, but meaning. Their loss marked more than the fall of ships. It was the unraveling of a philosophy that mistook devotion for destiny. The ocean claimed them not as victims, but as mirrors. In their reflection lies the most human of errors, the belief that excellence grants immunity from consequence. It is a lesson as old as war itself. Every generation builds its own Yamato, its own Akagi, its own myth of invincibility. Each imagines it has learned from the past, and each repeats it in a new language, faster, louder, more efficient, but no less fragile. Because the truth remains constant. Skill without renewal is vanity, and courage without reason is ruin. The Imperial Navy did not fall for lack of bravery. It fell because bravery alone could not compete with a world that had learned to industrialize progress. The more Japan perfected the art of the few, the more it condemned itself to be outlasted by the many. In the end, the Pacific kept its balance. The waves that once reflected rising suns and burning ships now move without trace or memory. The sea does not remember who won. It remembers only equilibrium, the quiet after the storm, the stillness that follows ambition. And so the story of Japan's carrier aviators is not one of tragedy alone, but of warning. They remind us that no power, however skilled or certain, is beyond decline. That mastery, if not renewed, becomes its own undoing. They ruled the skies once, then they vanished into the very silence they had conquered.